In 1980, speaking to priests, St. John Paul II said that the use of Latin in the liturgy is an indispensable condition for a proper relationship between modernity and antiquity, for dialogue among different cultures, and for reaffirming our Catholic identity. As we participate in this lecture, we learn to treasure the gift of Latin as a proper language of the Roman Catholic Church. We ask you through the intercession of our Blessed Mother, Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Thank you, Father Vidal. The Catholic Culture series highlights and explores some of the many ways in which our Catholic faith, centered on the worship of Almighty God in the sacred liturgy and the reception of God's grace in the sacraments, gives birth to a form or a way of life, that is to say, a culture. And one aspect of Catholic culture that is not well understood involves the Latin language. Now, some of you who may have roots in the Midwest may be familiar with the name of Matthias Loris. Matthias Loris was a native of France, but in 1837 he was consecrated the first bishop of Dubuque. And Loris has the unenviable distinction of having slapped St. John Vianney, having boxed his ears, as the old biography puts it. Yes, sadly, Loris and Vianney were classmates in France, even though Vianney was quite a bit older, about 6 years older than Loris. And Loris, who was an excellent student, was attempting to teach Vianney, who was a notoriously slow student, Latin. And on one occasion, Loris was so overcome with frustration at Vianney's struggles that he slapped him publicly. Although it's worth noting that Vianney, in wondrous humility, promptly dropped to his knees and begged Loris's forgiveness for being such a slow student. And at that point, Loris was overcome with emotion. And from that point on, the two of them became friends. But I mention this because I'm afraid that this episode encapsulates one view of Latin that has regrettably been prevalent at times. That is to say, Latin is a source of pain. Latin is a source of humiliation. It's an unnecessary burden. It's a dusty relic that ought to have been discarded long ago. Latin almost deprived the church of the very patron of priests. And yet, the seal of our university, which you can see just on this podium, bears two Latin inscriptions. And one of them is the name of an apostolic constitution that was issued by St. John Paul II on the Feast of the Assumption in the year 1990, and it's the charter of our university. It's called Ex Cordia Ecclesiae, and it called for the renewal of Catholic universities. But not quite 3 decades before that constitution, another saintly pope, John the 23rd, issued an apostolic constitution on the Feast of the Chair of St. Peter in St. Peter's Basilica itself, in the presence of 41 cardinals, as well as members of the Preparatory Commission for the upcoming Second Vatican Council. This document was called Veterum Sapientia, and in essence it called for, in fact insisted upon, the renewal of the study of Latin. And among the reasons that St. John the 23rd gave were unity and peace, not things we often associate with the study of Latin. Yet, not long after that document, Latin went into a steep decline, eclipsed by a more practical and productive modernity. So what are we to make of this? Apart from its venerable history, is there anything special about Latin? If not good riddance, should we not at least let it die a peaceful death? After all, Latin may be fine for those who want to study it, but please, not for everyone. Other languages are just as good, if not better, you might say. Or not. Is there something special about Latin for Catholics? Well, our speaker this evening, Father Dylan Schrader, is ideally suited to tackle these questions. He has the entire package. He's a priest, he's a scholar, he's a professor, he's a chaplain, and he's a pastor of souls. He has a PhD in systematic theology from the Catholic University of America. He's a widely published translator and author. He's written on Thomism, on the sacred liturgy, apologetics, and he has composed several hymns. He's an instructor at the Veterum Sapientia Institute and other venues, as well as the pastor of 2 parishes in his diocese of Jefferson City, Missouri. One, a very old parish of St. Joseph's in Westphalia, which goes back to 1835, and St. Anthony of Padua and Folk. He's not a complete stranger to Ave Maria. Some years back, he won an honorable mention for his doctoral dissertation, which was awarded by the Aquinas Center for Theological Renewal here. So please join me in welcoming Father Dylan Schrader.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be with all of you this evening. Let's hope this works. Okay, there we go. All right, the year is 1962. The day, as we just heard, February 22nd, the Feast of the Chair of St. Peter. The location is St. Peter's Basilica, which is full. Cardinals, bishops, priests, members of the Preparatory Commission for Vatican II, and many of the faithful. John the 23rd is presenting his new apostolic constitution. Now, an apostolic constitution is the highest level authority document that a pope can issue. And he signs it at the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica in the presence of all. This document is the Constitution Veterum Sapientia, the wisdom of the ancients, on the preservation and revival of the Latin language. So it was noted at the time just how unusual was the solemnity surrounding this particular document. John the 23rd used the full weight of his pontifical authority to send to the church a clear and decisive message that the Latin language must be preserved and must be revived for reasons which we'll explore. St. John the 23rd's effort makes sense if you see what he saw. In his speech, upon promulgating the document, he stressed its importance and he called the event a preview of Vatican II, the ecumenical council that, as we know, would begin later that same year. There's a photograph of him signing. So what is Veterum Sapientia? It's a papal document on the necessity of promoting the study of Latin. It tells us why the church holds Latin in such high esteem. It identifies 3 characteristics in particular that make Latin especially suited to the Catholic Church. That it is universal, it is unchangeable, and it is non-vernacular. This document is not just about the glories of Latin, however, it's also extremely practical. It issues specific directives, standards for seminaries and universities. One of them, seminary classes must be taught in Latin. Textbooks must be in Latin. Calls for the founding of an academic institute for Latin by the Holy See. Calls for the direction of the development of new words. Talk a little bit about that later on. And it calls for the development of a specific curriculum for teaching Christian Latin. There is a companion document. Even those who are familiar with Veterum Sapientiae are sometimes unfamiliar with the companion document, the so-called Ordinationes, which are the practical implementation of a curriculum that lays out a 9-year course for the study of Latin in great detail, telling you which authors and which works and which sections are to be studied at which time, developed to go along with this and to implement it. At the time, people thought that this document was going to be implemented. Unfortunately, it seems to be one of the least implemented documents in church history. There are some other candidates as well. In fact, the language of Veterum Sapientiae is quite forceful. Here's one example. Bishops and religious superiors are, quote, to ensure with all paternal solicitude that no one on his own authority, out of an appetite for innovation, shall write anything against the Latin language, either against its use in teaching the higher sacred disciplines or against its use in sacred ritual. Such people's prejudice is not to be allowed to dilute the will of the Apostolic See or interpret that will incorrectly. So much for free speech, huh? You know? John the 23rd was very serious about this. Another example, those who teach these disciplines in the largest universities and in all seminaries are bound to speak Latin and use textbooks written in Latin. Those who are not able to rise to the standard, to these precepts of the Holy See on account of ignorance of Latin are gradually to be replaced by other instructors who are qualified. Not knowing Latin can cost you your job. That's where the rubber hits the road, you know? So why did John the 23rd, a man who spoke often of peace and was a great lover of peace, at a time when the world was facing so many other difficulties and challenges, use such heavy-handed language and mandate such extreme measures when it comes to the Latin language of all things? And was he right? And if he was, what can we do about it today? So in this talk, I'd like to go over a few things. Just a very brief history of Latin in the Catholic Church. What the Church has said about Latin, a very tiny sliver of that. Our situation today, why I am convinced the Church must revive Latin, and how might we do it. So a brief history, very brief history of Latin in the Catholic Church. Let's begin with our Lord commissioning the apostles. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. The message of Jesus, the saving message of the gospel, along with the sacred powers to forgive sins, to consecrate, to make the church, spreads from Jerusalem throughout the world. On the day of Pentecost, we see the miracle of one faith being professed in a multitude of mutually intelligible languages because of the gift of the Holy Spirit. The gospel does spread, and as it spreads, it takes root. In part, this is made possible by the existence of the Roman Empire. And so the gospel spreads throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. At that time, the common language, the lingua franca, was Greek. But over time, of course, Latin came to dominate in the West. By the time of Tertullian, in the 2nd century, early 3rd century, we have really the first example of a significant ecclesiastical writer writing in the Latin language. The Apostolic Fathers write in Greek. But we have here in Tertullian an example of the use of Latin already. And he's the one from whom we get some vocabulary that we still use today, which highlights for us the shelf life of the Latin language, the continuity, words like Trinity. In fact, Tertullian discusses this. He puts forward several possibilities. How do we talk about the threeness of God? Should we use the word trios or the word trinitas, for example? And we've inherited a lot of that today. As time progresses, we come upon a situation where now the East continues to use Greek and the West now is using Latin. And this leads to some confusion. So one example is the word hypostasis, which literally translated into Latin is substantia, to stand under, something that stands under something else. But as this word takes on a technical meaning, in Greek it comes to mean the individual, and in Latin it comes to mean more what is common, the nature. So when talking about something like the Trinity, there's a little miscommunication or the danger of it. You can't just take the one word and translate it directly into another, and that famously causes some theological controversies. And it was recognized at the time. So I have here a quote from a letter from the early 400s from one of the Greek bishops saying, well, the Latin bishop who won't acknowledge three hypostases still actually believes what we believe, but it's because in his language you can't say that. That would mean three gods for them, but it means three persons for us. So in the early ecumenical councils, once we get to around this time period, we'll sometimes even see documents being issued simultaneously in Greek and in Latin, for the East and for the West. And we'll see a mutual acceptance of terminology. So like at the Council of Chalcedon, for instance, a recognition of the Latin terminology and the Greek terminology. It's a beautiful example of cooperation in the midst of great theological controversy. In the meantime, the liturgy too is developing, because the faith is not just a message, it's an entire existence. And it has to involve the worship of God and the celebration of sacred things. And so the faith that the apostles planted in all these different parts of the world takes root in those parts of the world and finds its own manner of expression in the place where it is. So naturally, as Latin became the predominant language in the West, and the liturgy in the West was developing, it developed into Latin. And it's true that in the West, the earlier liturgies were celebrated in other languages, probably Greek or Aramaic, but quite possibly also in Latin by people who were common Latin speakers at that time. But as we get the development of what we call today the Roman Rite, the normal way of celebrating the sacraments and the other liturgical ceremonies that's most familiar to us in the West, by the time that really takes on its own identity as a set liturgical family, its language is Latin. So, for example, by the late 5th century, we have the first real example of a liturgical book for the Roman Rite. Although we have parts of the Roman liturgy being referenced earlier, the Roman canon by St. Ambrose, for example, quoted in a few places. From the time of the early Middle Ages, Latin has now become the lingua franca in the West, and because of the universal significance of the Diocese of Rome, it's taken on a significance for the whole church, because all the dioceses throughout the world that are in communion with the Diocese of Rome have to communicate with Rome. And so the Latin language becomes the natural language for communication among the universal church, without prejudice to the tradition of preserving, for example, the Greek language in the East. And Latin remained a universal language in practice in the Middle Ages, when already the vernacular languages had developed and had taken over as the common spoken languages of people. Right? So people were being born into families where they were learning Proto-Italian, Proto-French, all these sorts of things. But in the university system, when people would study, because they studied in Latin, they had the ability to engage in conversation with their peers throughout the entire Western world. So that someone who was a student or a master of sacred theology at one university could go to a university in another country or read the works written by those in another place. And they could have this rich academic dialogue by virtue of their common language. And that use of Latin as an academic or official language, although not the normal spoken language of people, remained up until way more recently than we might realize. So here's an example of student notes from the Pontifical Biblical University in the mid-1960s. These are notes that the students would pass around to help them study for their final exam. And this is hundreds of pages entirely in Latin. So people were coming from all over the world to study at the pontifical universities, and they were able to pass notes around to each other because of their common academic language. Another example right there. So, okay, what has the church said about Latin? And here I'm just taking a few excerpts. There's so much written on this. I want to recommend at least one book if you just want to know some things the church has said about Latin. Now, word of caution, some of this is in Latin and in Italian. It's not in English, but I've got a collection here of just some quotations from the church on the Latin language. Let's take a look here. We're going to start back in kind of the early part of the history here in terms of what has the church officially done with regard to Latin. Well, famously, we have Pope Damasus I commissioning St. Jerome to get the Latin Bible situation squared away. Now, Jerome wasn't the first one to translate the Bible into Latin. In fact, that's the reason he was put on the job, that there were various Latin versions, collectively called the Old Latin, and they didn't all agree. Some were better than others, and the Pope wanted this to be fixed up. And so he commissioned the best person for the job, St. Jerome. And in this way, we had sort of a quasi-official Latin Bible for the Western Church. It took on a more official status 1,000 years later at the Council of Trent. There was a condemnation of something called the trilingual heresy, which was kind of a weird heresy, but it was based on the idea that on the cross of Jesus, there were 3 languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, and that therefore, those are the only 3 languages in which you could rightly pray to God. The church said, well, that's not true, right? As much as we love Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, you are allowed to pray in other languages. It's okay. God understands those too. So there was the condemnation of that. So here we see, okay, the church is upholding a principle that the fact that we favor or support the preservation of a language is not necessarily to the detriment of other languages. The church's universality is not threatened. Her diversity in unity is not threatened by prominence given to a single language. The Council of Trent upheld the authority of Jerome's Vulgate. Now, to note here, this authority has a special juridic value. It's a kind of canonical authority. It doesn't mean that it's the only version that can be used. In fact, Trent specifically did not want to prejudice the Septuagint translation, for example, the Greek translation, right? So the Vulgate has a special place in academic uses and disputations and things like that. But it's not the only version that Catholics can use. And then the Council of Trent also wanted to uphold the importance of Latin in the liturgy. At that time, mainly because that was seen as one of the clear ways of distinguishing Catholic from Protestant worship. Now, the Council of Trent discussed a number of things that also were discussed at Vatican II. It talked about, for example, offering the faithful communion under both forms, under the form of bread and the form of wine, and decided against it for a number of practical reasons. But there were also other changes, like the use of the vernacular, which Vatican II famously discussed. And the Council of Trent decided against it, mainly because of the importance of preserving the tradition and because of the danger of this newfangled thing called Protestantism. And they didn't want Catholic worship to be confused with it, so they were very, very careful about that at that time. When we come to Vatican II, skipping some time, but coming to Vatican II, it calls for the preservation of Latin in the Latin rites, okay, which is to say basically essentially the Western Church. It also calls for the faithful the lay faithful to be taught to say or sing their parts of the Mass. So the Second Vatican Council specifically says that the lay faithful should be taught to say or sing basically the order of Mass. The responses, the Gloria, the Creed, those kind of common, unchangeable parts of the Mass. A few years later, 1967, in the document Musicam Sacram, it gets a little more specific. It says pastors should teach the faithful to do this. So Vatican II doesn't say who's responsible for doing it, but a few years later they said it's the leaders of the church, it's bishops and priests. And the document on priestly formation mandates that seminarians would learn Latin, allowing them to make use of the sources that they'll need for philosophy and theology. A few quotes then from some of the more recent popes. So Pope Pius XII. The use of the Latin language, customary in a considerable portion of the church, is a manifest and beautiful sign of unity, as well as an effective antidote for any corruption of doctrinal truth. In spite of this, the use of the mother tongue in connection with several of the rites may be of much advantage to the people, but the Apostolic See alone is empowered to grant this permission. Now, sometimes people don't realize, but prior to Vatican II, there was already a strong movement of and official authorization of the use of vernacular translations, not in the Mass, but in the other sacraments. So, for example, prior to the Second Vatican Council, you could celebrate a baptism almost entirely in English, with just a few parts that would remain in Latin. There were blessings that could be given in the vernacular languages and things like that, weddings, funerals, things like that. So there was an opening to the use of people's common languages, but in conjunction with Latin. And the Mass was the one that they really, at that time, were not touching. So here, Pius XII is saying, Latin has this important quality that must be preserved, and he points to the preservation of doctrinal truth. In other words, his fear is that if we change the words of how we pray, we're going to change what people believe, or at least run the risk of it. At the same time, there can be an advantage to allowing some use of people's common languages, but he says it's the Apostolic See alone that can do that. So it's not just, Father so-and-so, whoever, on his own authority doing it. St. Paul VI actually established the Pontifical Institute for Higher Latin. So John the 23rd called for it. You notice I skipped John the 23rd here because we started with him, right? But Paul VI actually did it, right? He also issued a little booklet called Jubilate Deo. So I have the first edition and the second edition here. And what this is the minimum repertoire of Latin chant that all Catholics of the Latin Church are supposed to know. In 1974, he gave a copy of this to all bishops of the world, along with a letter asking them to use it in the instruction of the faithful, and, most importantly of all, granting free copyright permission. If you're involved in church music, you know how important that is, right? The Holy See wasn't making any money off of this one. Okay. A publisher actually giving you free music. That's great. The subtitle of this book is Easier Gregorian Chants that the faithful are supposed to learn according to the understanding of the Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy of the Second Vatican Council. So I have the original edition and I have the second edition here. So these are practical steps. This is the Pope saying, okay, the Vatican II says the faithful are supposed to know some parts in Latin, to be able to sing them. What does that look like exactly? He just says, here you go, it's this book. St. John Paul II, when he promulgated the Code of Canon Law in 1983, in Canon 249, says that in the program of priestly formation, seminarians are to be well-versed in Latin, and also to have a suitable knowledge of other languages that might be useful to pastoral ministry. So the expression here, bene caleant, calere is to have a skill. It's a robust practical knowledge. It's not necessarily a speculative knowledge. It's to be skilled at something. So it's to be good at it. You know, so if you're a carpenter, you're a good carpenter, it's that kind of skill only with Latin. If you're an artist and you're a good artist, it's that kind of skill with Latin. So in other words, it's a very practical thing, right? To be able to read and write and to use the Latin language. That's still on the books today. That's in the Code of Canon Law today. In Dominici Cene, among many other places, he was Pope for so long, he spoke about Latin many times, but in this particular paragraph, a document on the Eucharist, he talks about the obligation that the Catholic Church has toward the Latin language, which is striking to think about it, that the Catholic Church owes something to Latin. That this thing, it's not a person, it's not even really a thing, it's a phenomenon. It's something that we have a debt to, and that we ought to pay that debt. Benedict XVI upgraded the Pontifical Institute for Higher Latin into the Pontifical Academy for Latin and called for the renewal and expansion of some of its programs. He spoke about the urgent necessity of supporting the greater use of Latin. He also issued, of course, as we know, Summorum Pontificum, acknowledging that the older liturgical books in Latin had never been abrogated and therefore in principle could be used. And he repeated in Sacramentum Caritatis, the post-synodal apostolic exhortation on the Eucharist, his plea that priests would learn Latin and Gregorian chant. And as we'll see in a little bit, also the faithful, the same thing that Vatican II had said. Pope Francis has several times spoken about the importance and the beauty and power of Latin. So a couple years ago, he called it a treasure of knowledge and thought, a key to accessing the classic texts that have shaped our world. And he calls it a tool for harmony among peoples, promoting mutual respect and human dignity. Among the many practical ways in which the Holy See has recognized or called for the use of Latin, one is in multicultural liturgies or multicultural gatherings. So if members of the faithful from different parts of the world or different language groups are gathering for the celebration of Mass, the Holy See has said, well, why not allow people to do the Mass parts or some of them in Latin so that everyone is saying the Lord's Prayer or the Gloria in the same language for the sake of unity. So what is our situation today? Let's take a look. Unfortunately, most seminaries fail to meet the standard expected by the Code of Canon Law. So when you think about what the standard in the Code of Canon Law really is, bene calere, it's to be well-skilled in Latin. And probably most seminaries are not meeting that. In many places you might have a year of Latin or 2 years. It might be optional, but it's not being given the emphasis that is envisioned. I have some sympathy, so I'm not trying to be too critical. I have some sympathy because there are many documents from the Holy See calling for seminaries to do things, and it's hard to implement everything, but I think Latin is extremely important. We should make an effort. In just the last 15 years or so, we've seen a shift in church documents. Now, I say 15 years, but it's also important to keep in mind that for decades now, church documents have not been, for the most part, written in Latin, drafted in Latin. They've been drafted in some other language and then translated into Latin. And you'll notice this in the style, too, which is deliberate. So one of the people who worked in the Latin letters office at the Vatican and I were talking about this once, and he said that, when they translate now documents into the official Latin version, there's constraints placed on them because they want the Latin version to match the original version stylistically. So if you go back to Pius XII, or even before, Leo XIII, for example, you'll find gloriously written Latin encyclicals, beautiful, beautiful Latin style. Our modern documents are a little more functional. They have a beauty of their own, but it's often closer to our modern languages because that's usually where the origin of the document is. However, even that being the case, the last 15 years, we've seen a drastic decline in the church's use of Latin on the official level. So an example would be Pope Francis's first encyclical, Lumen Fidei, on the day that it was issued in several languages at once, and one of them was Latin. But just a few years later, Laudato Si only came out in Latin months after all the other languages had been released. So they released it in English, Spanish, Italian, etc., and then months, and they were still working on the Latin version, which means that the world was discussing it, and there wasn't an official version. So when people argue about a single word or a phrase, and we don't even have a text, it's hard to do that. You need a standard version. It lagged behind by several months with Laudato Si. With Amoris Laetitia, the same thing happened. The world was feverishly discussing the meaning of very specific paragraphs and footnotes in Amoris Laetitia months before we actually had the official version. And by the way, when the official version comes out online, that's not even really the official version. The official version is the one published in the Acts of the Holy See, and that is years behind in the publication process. And they do make changes. They tweak things after the internet release versus the printed version. And sometimes a word matters. It's now, today, rare for documents even to have a Latin version. To my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, to my knowledge, Fratelli Tutti, an encyclical letter, doesn't have a Latin version, for example. This is a photo I took at St. Louis University Library one time. The Incuridium Vaticanum Vatican Handbook is just a collection of documents issued by the Holy See every year. And as you can see, there's an old series, there's a new series. This is volume 29 of the new series. And up until this point, every volume has a Latin text and an Italian text. And so the spines all say Latino Italiano, Latin Italian. And then in 2015, they just give up because there's no more Latin versions, or very few. And they just gave up. It tells a story all its own. There's also, I just want to acknowledge the whiplash effect, the experience that people have had, regardless of whether people favor or disfavor whatever the traditional Latin Mass, whatever your opinion on it is, just acknowledge that there's a change, that the official attitude toward it has changed from Pope Benedict to Pope Francis. And regardless of what your thoughts are about that, it's hard for people to experience change, especially when it comes to something as important to us as worship. So I just want to acknowledge that. Let's take a look at a couple of examples, because you want to say, well, Father Schrader, everything is translated. Everything is translated. Why do we need to look at Latin? Well, okay, let's go to the Vatican website here. So here's the document I mentioned earlier from Benedict XVI, Sacramentum Caritatis on the Eucharist, actually talking about Latin, but with a misleading English translation. So the English version down here, after it talks about priests, it says, nor should we forget that the faithful can be taught to recite the more common prayers in Latin and also to sing parts of the liturgy to Gregorian chant. Well, that sounds nice. The faithful can learn too. All right. Don't forget. Okay? But in Latin, what does it say? Neque negligantur copia ipsis fidelibus facienda. This is, we shouldn't forget the duty we have to empower the faithful. So this is a gerundive. This is the most emphatic way you can express necessity in Latin. There's like 15 ways to express that you have to do something, and this is the most powerful one. This is the strongest one. And copiam facere is a nice expression that means something like to enable or to empower. But it says, you have to do this. Let's look at a document of Vatican II. This is an ecumenical council, and this is its document on religious liberty, which is an important one, and one that is scrutinized down to the single word. On the Vatican website, this is what you'll find in the English version of this document. All right, No one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. This is the definition of religious liberty. So it's a document on religious liberty saying people have a right to religious liberty, and it's defining what religious liberty is. But notice this, contrary to his own beliefs. However, in the official version, contra suam conscientiam, which is actually said twice, and here it's collapsed into one. Well, conscience and belief are two different things. It matters, so that matters. And here's a translation familiar to all of us who are over 14 years old, from the Mass, which we heard many, many times. So when supper was ended, he took the cup, which was apparently a translation of this, right? Which you can just tell is a lot longer, right? Taking this precious chalice in his holy and venerable hands, he took the cup, right? So, well, we all know. There's plenty of examples like that. But on the official international level, this was the same in 1969 as it is today, as it was 1,000 years ago, you know? And it's just our translation that didn't reflect it and had to be changed, and now they're changing the other books, and it could always happen again. So it creates an effect where the faithful who are speaking English are missing out on what people are hearing in either Latin or other languages that are more accurate. And thankfully we corrected that, but it had to be corrected. So now we come to the heart of the matter, why the church must revive Latin. The first thing I want to say is that Latin is not a magic language. Sometimes there are people who are so in love with Latin that they talk about it as if it is per se, by itself, this sacred language and descended from the heavens. But Latin is just a regular language. And if you study Latin and you read Latin stuff, you'll see that. Whether it's the classics or it's medieval poetry, it's satire or whatever it is, or all of the mistakes being made in medieval conversational texts and plays and things or whatever it is, it's a normal language. It's a real human language, and it has the full range of expression. What makes Latin special, and I would say sacred, is not anything innate to it on its own, but it's how it's been used by divine providence. And there's simply nothing that can replace that. This simply happens to be the language in which most Catholic thought has been recorded for us in the West. And apart from a time machine, we can't change that. So whether you love Latin or hate it, you can't change the fact that it's been there. And that's what gives it value, because God has used it in his providence. And this is what John the 23rd points to in Veterum Sapientia. Amid the variety of languages, the one that shines most clearly is that which first arose in Latium and went on to serve wondrously in spreading the Christian name throughout the lands of the West. Truly it came about by a divine plan that the language which through many centuries had united a wide-ranging family of peoples under the authority of the Roman Empire, thereafter became the household language of the Apostolic See, and thus preserved for posterity, bound the Christian peoples of Europe together with one another. In some places, the church even speaks about the church herself as sort of the successor to the Roman Empire. And again, it's no coincidence, but it's in God's plan that the Prince of the Apostles and the great evangelist of the nation, St. Paul, so Peter and Paul, would shed their blood in the eternal city. And that from that moment onward, the central see of the entire universal church would be the city of Rome. God arranged for all this to happen because he sent his son into the world in the fullness of time, at a deliberately chosen time and place, one in which the Pax Romana had allowed for the spread of the gospel. So in here, this is to no detriment not to denigrate Hebrew and Greek, because God certainly chose the people of Israel and prepared them and their language and the Greek language for the New Testament, but the spread of the Roman Empire created a situation in which the gospel could be preached to the ends of the earth more easily. So in time, Latin did take on qualities that make it unique. So in addition to how divine providence has used it, it now has additional qualities, not of its own nature, but because of how providence has used it over time, it's acquired certain qualities. These are that it's universal, unchangeable, and non-vernacular. So in a nutshell, the Catholic Church by its nature requires all local churches to be in communion with the Church of Rome. And in a practical sense, that communion requires that you occasionally talk to the church in Rome. And so there's a certain universality that's present because of the nature of the church. And so it makes sense that the language that became predominant in the See, the Central See, would be usable and recognizable to the entire church. And in fact, by being so, Latin shows itself to be impartial because it's not the language of any one race or country. Not everyone has to speak American English or Italian or French or whatever. It has no favorites. It's also, today, unchangeable in a way that few languages are. So its grammatical structure and basic vocabulary is relatively fixed. The new additions to the Latin language come mainly in the form of vocabulary. And as John the 23rd called for, the church does have a sort of official way of doing that. And there are dictionaries of Neo-Latin, and there's also, non-Catholic and humanist people working on this stuff all the time too. But Latin is unchangeable in the sense that the basic vocabulary and the grammatical structure are fixed, which puts it in contrast to modern languages which are constantly in a state of flux. And it's also non-vernacular. The way that the language has been refined and developed over the centuries means that sort of by definition today, it's not your common language in the street. So just by virtue of that, it's set apart in a certain way. To synthesize, I am personally convinced that the Catholic Church must revive Latin because the Church is an ancient community, a global community, and an everlasting community. The Church is an ancient community. The loss of Latin cuts us off from the past. The vast majority of thought, of what Catholics in the West experienced, that we have access to. We can't read their thoughts. We can only look at what has been preserved for us, and most of that is in the form of writing, and most of that writing is in Latin, and most of it hasn't been translated. And in fact, a lot of it is in manuscript form and has never even been edited. But it's there. And if we want to know what our ancestors thought and felt and experienced, Latin gives us access to a huge portion of it. Imagine setting a torch to the Catholic equivalent of the Library of Alexandria. Well, that's essentially what we do, because what good is a library if no one can read the books in it? They might be there, but if you can't read them, if no one does read them, it may as well not be there. And that's essentially what we're on the verge of doing with our Latin literary heritage, if we're not careful. It's also typical for ancient religions, like Catholicism. We're an ancient religion, to have a distinctive language. So the Jewish people have Hebrew, Muslims have Arabic, Catholics of the Latin Church have Latin, Roman Catholics have Latin. And Latin has a sizable vocabulary of technical words in theology and philosophy to some extent, but especially in theology, liturgy, canon law, etc., and church stuff that just has not been replicated in any modern language. The English theological vocabulary available to us is just embryonic by comparison to the Latin vocabulary, so that sometimes when you're reading early modern or medieval sources, even if they're translated, you'll find things just left in Latin because we just don't have words for it in English with the same precision. So if you want to continue the conversations that the scholastics had across all of Western Europe for centuries, if you want to be part of that same conversation, you got to speak the same language and use the same words. The church is also a global community, so why should the whole world have to use Italian or English, for that matter? And yet there's also a great danger in lacking a single usable language. So our options are basically everyone uses a single language or a handful of languages, or everyone uses their own language. I would argue that everyone using their own language for everything in the universal church is unsustainable. I would also argue that even a small number puts us in danger of ambiguities and miscommunications that would be eliminated by a single common language. And if you're going to have a single common language for the whole church, it may as well be Latin, because it's what we've been using for so long. If there were an ecumenical council held today, for example, they'd probably have simultaneous translation or something, but then the bishops would be, to some extent, talking past each other, which could put us in, it would be hard. It would be very hard. Yeah, like I said, people argue over the meaning of a single word or a phrase. You need an official version. So even if the conversation's not happening live in Latin, when you put something in writing and the Pope signs it and says, you know, Catholics, you have to accept this, what this reflects, you need a version of it. Because you're binding people's consciences. You're binding not just their outward words and actions, but what they must believe or hold to be true. And they need to know what it is and what it isn't. You need a standard version. And the church is going to last until the world ends. So if the world lasts 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, we're still going to be here. And I think it's much more likely that people will be able to read Latin in 500 years than modern English, probably, or anything we're saying today. And even if they could, when the theologian of 2500, the year 2500, opens up his copy of Denzinger, whatever edition that is it going to be in 50 different languages? Because of the fragmentation that's occurred? That's going to be very, very challenging. We condemn ourselves to trivialities in a certain sense if we're so short-sighted that we're not thinking centuries in the future. The church documents that are coming out today, 1,000 years from now, are people going to be able to read them? 100 years from now, et cetera, et cetera. And if we're not saying anything that's worth saying 100 years from now, granted that you would want to address particular contemporary situations and things like that from time to time, but if we're not saying anything that's going to matter in 100 years, maybe we should rethink what we're doing, because as Catholics, our faith is perennial, and what we're professing is perennial. And the fact that we're looking at things from the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Chalcedon, the Council of Trent, are people going to be looking at what we're saying today? We can't be short-sighted. A few objections. Doesn't the church have more pressing needs? Probably, undoubtedly. However, I don't think ignorance of Latin is going to solve any of those things. And it's my hope that a revival of Latin, which would allow Catholics to engage with their faith at a new level, would be an impetus toward addressing all these other things. I don't think cutting us off from our past and fragmenting us further into individual countries and language groups is going to help us address the bigger problems. Couldn't we be helping the poor instead? Well, yeah, I'll take out the word instead and say, yeah, we should be helping the poor. But again, I don't think Latin is in competition with helping the poor. And if anything, hopefully, a greater sense of Catholic identity would actually move us to greater compassion for those in need. Well, why not go back to Greek or Aramaic? Nothing wrong with Greek or Aramaic. But the fact of the matter is simply that Latin has been the language for the majority of Western history in the Catholic world. So that's it. Absolutely nothing wrong with Greek or Aramaic. And if Greek had been preserved in the West, that's what we should be using in the West. And I'm speaking of the West here. The East should preserve its own sacred languages as well. And are you saying that you want to eliminate vernacular languages in Mass or other prayers? We're just going to go back to Latin. We're going to burn all the English liturgical books, right? No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that, actually. I don't think that the preservation of Latin has to mean the elimination of other languages. It's simply a matter of saying, well, how many Masses are said on a given weekend in the United States, for example? Thousands, easily, tens of thousands, I don't know. And how many of them are in Latin? And could there be like a Mass that's accessible to people in Latin? But I'm also not talking here just about the Mass. A lot of what I'm saying is about the official use of Latin by the Church on the official level. There's room for Latin in the Latin Church. Let's make some more room. Okay, Latin has no practical use on the parish level. Well, maybe the Pope and the bishops should be issuing their documents in Latin, but what does that have to do with me and my regular parish? Well, believe it or not, there's a lot of resources. There's a lot of stuff helpful to parish priests that exists only in Latin. There are handbooks on things that we experience every day. And you might say, well, some of them are a little outdated, but there's a lot that's relevant. I'll give you one personal example. The year 2020, when we were first trying to figure out what to do about the coronavirus pandemic, and we didn't know. I didn't know how bad it was going to be. No one knew what was happening. It was very unclear. One of the things that I went back to once we realized that there was something happening was a manual for priests on how to administer the sacraments in time of plague from a few hundred years ago. Not the first time the church has encountered a plague. And if you want to know, well, what is it reasonable to do when distributing Holy Communion? How do I give communion to someone, reverently, but also in a way that's safe and things like that? What are my obligations? How obliged am I morally as a priest to give someone the last rites, for example, if I might get sick and die? Questions like that. Well, people have thought through these things, and I found it very helpful. And I will just add, there are still current liturgical books that are only in Latin. The Ordo Lectionum Missae, the Ordo Cantus Missae, for example. And on a symbolic level, even the ordinary parish priest is sort of a visible link from his local community to the universal church, which is a beautiful thing we have as Catholics. We're in communion with our bishop is in communion with all the bishops of the world and the Bishop of Rome, and that just connects us to everyone else. And the fact that, just your local priest has access to a Catholic universal language that other people are using throughout the world, even just other clergy, is kind of a symbolic sign of unity. So what can we do? How might we do it? There are some signs of hope. First of all, Hebrew was successfully revived as a spoken language, believe it or not. Eliezer ben Yehuda and others, but a serious, gritty effort to bring Hebrew back from being a biblical language to being a modern spoken language. It was done. So it's amazing what a community can do with its language when it really tries. There is still institutional memory today if we act now. There are still people alive today who were taught by the great Vatican Latinists. And you might say Latin is a dead language, and in one sense that's true, because at some point in the distant past, the last person who was born into a Latin-speaking household died. But there has never been, since that time, a day on earth where there wasn't somebody working in the Pope's Curia who was speaking Latin, even today. So in a way, Latin is more alive than most of our other languages that come and go. There's an unbroken chain, and there are people today alive who were trained by the great Vatican Latinists, but I don't know how much time we have with that. There's more interest in Latin today, both in the church and, believe it or not, in the secular world. Latin is seeing kind of a revival. So there's some excitement there. Latin is hot again, I guess. You know, let's capitalize on that. Let's look at some things we did. I said Veterum Sapientiae was like the most ignored document in church history, but it wasn't ignored immediately. It was sadly, basically ignored after John the 23rd died, and things kind of shifted away and focus shifted to other things. But the Ordinationes were issued. They created the curriculum. They started the journal Latinitas. There were international conventions held discussing how do we say this in Latin, this modern thing that we have. I am blessed to have a copy of one of the records of one of those conventions here. Conventus de Verbis Novis Latinis. So in here you'll find detailed discussions of how to say the words for modern things. This sort of work led to the publication of the Lexicon Recentis Latinitatis by the Vatican. There's a dictionary of modern words in Latin that is standardized. So that happened. We have that. We also have books published with the names of places. What's the place name for, Walla Walla or whatever, right? The names of people. Many of us modern people have names that are not exactly, directly renderable in Latin, but there are lexicons of those things. There's still an annual Latin contest that the Vatican puts on. That was something else that came out of Veterum Sapientiae. Here's now one of my suggestions on the high level of the church. What could we do? I think the Pontifical Academy of Latin, which already exists, could do something like this. A 1 or 2 year intensive program, entirely in Latin, I would say with Greek allowed, because Latin borrows a lot from Greek anyway. It's a normal thing. It's okay. With courses or formation across the board, full scholarships. Now that's where the rubber hits the road here. And we'd ask for seminarians and religious, maybe lay people. I just think it's easier for a bishop to mandate a seminarian to do something than it is to, but lay people ideally too. But let's send them all to Rome for a year of Latin immersion, maybe 2 years. And then they will go back and they will spread. And I say a quota system, like let's say your diocese has to send someone every 10 years or something, whatever it's going to be reasonable. But let's start doing this and let's pay for it. It won't cost you anything. I don't know how you accomplish that part of it, but it can be done. There is a place doing this. It's not Catholic, it's secular humanist. But the Vivarium Novum is successfully doing this. And they offer full scholarships. They take young boys just out of high school from across the entire world, even from extreme poverty, if they show the interest and the aptitude. And they do a year, sometimes 2, pure Latin immersion. I have met people who have done this, and they're unbelievable speakers of Latin. In the scheme of things, a year sounds like a long time, but if it's really not that much. You could spend 5 years studying Latin in classes in school, or you could spend 1 year speaking nothing but Latin and come out really good. And then they can teach others. So this is being done in the secular world. It could be done by the church, I think. Okay, what about on more local levels? I would say reintroduction of Latin into Catholic school curricula. We have grade schools and high schools. Let's just, if Latin's not on the curriculum in a high school, let's get it on the curriculum. I'm hoping for a trickle-down effect. Those who are studying in immersion environments and then coming back to their own diocese or their own religious order or whatever are then teaching Latin, and they have the fluency to be able to do it really well. If we train them in modern language pedagogy, even better. Because there are modern methods available, which I'll mention just very, very briefly here at the end, that are much more effective for most people than the way Latin was so-called traditionally taught. But actually, the way it was really traditionally taught is the living Latin approach. One place that's trying to do this is the Veterum Sapia Institute, of which I'm a member. We offer summer full immersion workshops for clergy, religious, seminarians, and for lay people, and for those with no previous Latin experience. If you want to come and you want to speak nothing but Latin for a week, you can do it. And we do it. And it's amazing how much people can improve. And if you've had some Latin but have never spoken it, it's frustrating at first because you make a lot of mistakes and you actually know better, but you can't say it correctly, quickly. But you activate the knowledge you already have. The knowledge that's already there becomes activated really fast with a lot of patience. But this is the environment to do it. We also have online classes. High school, even now middle school, homeschooling, college, you get college credit. We offer a diploma in church Latin. We have a Latin teaching credential. So if you want to not just learn Latin, but learn how to teach Latin effectively, we have a Latin teaching credential. Online private tutoring. This is the place that's trying to do it in the United States. There are effective strategies. One of the most effective strategies that the research has shown in the last couple decades is comprehensible input. That's actually part of a larger set of methods, but the basic idea is you need to take in a lot of material that you understand most of in the target language. Now, as Catholics, we have a great advantage because we have a lot of material that's repetitive. And so we already have a pool of material that we're going to understand a lot of. So the Mass, the prayers, the things like we said, the Ave Maria before this, So we have the material there, and we can use that. Repetition is our friend, and as Catholics, we have a lot of repetition. Latin exposure. Here I'm going to distinguish between Latin and learning. Okay, not everyone is going to learn Latin, but they can learn some Latin, or they can learn about Latin, or they can at least learn not to be afraid of Latin. And they can be exposed to Latin. And we can do this all the time, in little ways. So for example, just introduction of chants from the booklet that Paul VI asked us to learn. And you could do this on a rotating basis. Maybe during Easter you sing the Gloria in Latin. During Lent you sing the Sanctus in Latin. You just, over the course of the year, you pick them out. Maybe you do the seasonal Marian antiphons, whatever it is. If you've got school children, even better for them. If they memorize some Latin chants, first of all, the music makes it much easier to remember, and then they can lead the Mass for the parish, and they can show the adults just what they're capable of. And it's amazing how much kids can learn. Frequent, non-threatening, non-politicized exposure to Latin, short Latin words and phrases. I say non-politicized because I hate to say it. Latin has been co-opted to some extent. But this language is for all Catholics, it's for everyone. Little things, having a motto in Latin. Putting in your bulletin, if there's a saint of the week, did the saint have a motto? Did they say something? Did they say something in Latin? Just a couple words. Just keep it out there. It's exposure. Just normalizing the presence of Latin in our lives, right? Little things like grace before meals, the souls of the faithful departed to the mercy of God rest in peace. Little things like that. At the Veterum Sapia Institute, we've seen the greatest success through just upfront honesty about some of the obstacles to Latin acquisition. So one is the affective filter, which is what we call basically the emotional condition of the person. So if you're afraid of making a mistake, if you're tired, if you're hungry, you're not going to learn very well. So we create a really non-threatening environment. And I just think the church as a whole needs to kind of do that. Like, let's take the sting out of Latin a little bit, you know? Like, let's bring it back, and if there's going to be mistakes or people are going to disagree about it or whatever, it's like, let's just bring it back, you know? It's okay. High tolerance for mistakes. Because the thing is, when you're obsessing about making mistakes, you're not speaking Latin. When you're making mistakes, you're speaking Latin, and you're getting better. This is something that Dr. Nancy Llewellyn once said that always stuck with me. She's the sort of co-founder of the Veterum Sapiens Institute. She said we can either have dead perfection or living imperfection. You can have perfect Ciceronian sentences on a page, or you can have less than perfect Latin being spoken by people. The analogy I use is that we treat Latin sometimes like it's the fine china in the cabinet that never gets used. It just sits there and gathers dust because we don't want to break it, you know. But let's put it on the table, and it might get chipped, but it's okay. We're using it. And friendly. Let's be proud of Latin. Let's be excited about Latin, you know. We don't have to be embarrassed about it or ashamed of it, you know. Let's bring it back and let's be happy about it. So this is happening in the secular world. Again, the secular world is reviving Latin in a way that is unexpected, at least by me. So you got a guy like Luke Ranieri, who has a great YouTube channel, excellent Latinist. And he makes certain videos like this one where his friend has translated some Disney songs into Latin and he sings them, and they're really well done, you know? There's stuff like that. There's no reason that the church can't do something similar. We can just make Latin a fun part of our life. And I would say there's value in using Latin in non-church contexts. So if the only time you saw water or thought about water was at baptism, you actually would be missing out on some of the meaning of baptism. It's because you know what water is that the symbol of baptism has its meaning. It's because you know what a father is that calling God Father has meaning for you. And so when you're reading the pagan texts or the modern text, or the Renaissance text or whatever in Latin that are not church stuff at all, you're getting connotations and imagery that is going to connect more. And so even stuff like doing these videos, you know, like where it talks about, hey, you know, genuflect, show some respect, right? You're going to learn Latin words for bowing down in reverence to something, you know, right? That's useful to us in the church context. So we don't want to limit Latin exposure merely to the liturgy or prayer. So sometimes people who treat Latin as an extremely sacred language don't want it to be used for anything but prayer and sacred liturgy. And I don't want to be irreverent. I'm not saying to mock sacred things at all, but I'm saying it's a language and it can be used for anything. And there's other material out there that we can just borrow and bring into our classrooms, into our homes, and so forth. And so, to conclude, these are my thoughts. The church has consistently called for and commanded the preservation of the Latin language. In practice, this has been mostly ignored in recent years. I suggest that this ignorance has not benefited us, and that John the 23rd's vision was essentially correct. Now, today, in our situation, we might consider his mandate to be a little heavy-handed, but can we apply his vision in perhaps a less threatening or friendlier way, or a way that's likely to have greater practical impact in the situation of today? I think there is great hope, but I think we must act. So with that, I'll finish. I think, is there time for some questions here? How do we do this? Okay, yeah, sure, either way.
So my question is back to Pope John the 23rd, and I was curious what you know, what he envisioned, why he wrote such a strong it wasn't an encyclical, but about the Latin language. What was he seeing that he thought that needed to be written at that time?
Yeah, thank you. Excellent question. Yeah, it was an apostolic constitution, which is the highest level, and he had this global vision for the church. You know, he saw there were a lot of problems. You know, I mean, he wrote an encyclical on peace because of they were post World War II, but not by much. And there's great fear. There's fear about communism. There's fear about another world war, nuclear disaster. I mean, all kinds of stuff, right? So he saw the need for, I think, unity, and for the church to be unified within itself so that it could speak to the modern world. Like, how is the church going to offer humanity the only real solution to the world's problems, which is the message of Jesus, if we're fragmenting within ourselves? So we're losing touch with our past, and we're losing our ability to communicate with one another. A practical example of that would be at the Second Vatican Council. They actually discussed what language to have it in. And believe it or not, Esperanto was a real candidate. Some people wanted to use Esperanto, but they decided to do it in Latin. And so we have all the records of Vatican II, which are almost entirely in Latin. There were, sadly, a few bishops in the world who just couldn't manage it, but there were very few. So at that time, even at that time, almost all of the bishops of the entire world could carry on a conversation in Latin, which they did at the Second Vatican Council. So in a nutshell, I think John the 23rd had this sense the church has got to get its own act together so we can speak to the modern world, and we need to be unified to do that.
Hello, thank you very much for the very wonderful talk. In my experience in the church, I've been in sort of spaces where the use of Latin is incredibly associated with the sort of political context, tragically, and I've never really seen it that way, but there are people, including priests and seminarians, who sort of wince a little bit at its use. And just to You've given some very good pointers as to how to do this, but if you could elaborate a little more on some ways to maybe disarm this kind of hostility sort of in the air, where there shouldn't be any.
Thank you, great question. Yeah, I really have great sympathy for people that have lived through tumultuous times and have come to associate certain things with things that they experienced as harmful. We're all not necessarily rational 100% of the time. And, if you had an experience of Latin that was hard for you or difficult for you, so if you were a kid, you went to Mass, and you just found it to be totally nonsensical because you couldn't understand any of it, I can totally sympathize with how you might be skeptical about, are we going back to that, that kind of thing. So I want to emphasize what I say, the practically non-threatening approach with respect for people's emotional experiences. And so the thing I primarily emphasize would be the reintroduction of Latin doesn't mean the elimination of other languages. And so to do it on a rotating basis, or to do it on a basis where you have a Mass in English and a Mass in Latin, in terms of the liturgy, I do think on the official level we've got to get back to Latin for the reasons I mentioned. But I would start with wanting to understand where the person's reticence or what their experience comes from, or what their experience has been, and to listen to them and maybe to hear some about that, to just kind of see where they're coming from. But I have not seen the same resistance among young children, I'll say that. My experience of teaching simple prayers to children, like the sign of the cross, they think it's neat. I think it's interesting. And they're proud that they can learn something in another language. So I take great joy in that.
What about the negative attitude of the Pope toward the Latin Mass? How are you going to get through that?
How am I going to get through that? That's a question I ask myself every day. I know. That's a really, that's a major question, right? I'll be honest, there's a lot that's above my pay grade. I don't know what's going to happen to the traditional form of the Mass, the liturgy. I mean, on the global level, or even on my own local level in the next couple of years, I really don't know. I will say that Pope Francis has spoken positively about the Latin language and has called for a more faithful celebration of the revised liturgical books, which I would say includes the reincorporation of Latin to some extent. And then I'll just acknowledge that, yeah, there's kind of a whiplash effect with regard to the traditional forms of the liturgy. In a way, this is my personal speculation, in a way, I think Benedict and Francis have followed or have applied the same principle, but to opposite effect. So one of the things Benedict emphasized was that the faith of the Church before Vatican II and after Vatican II is the same. Therefore, the way we prayed before Vatican II can reflect our faith today. And therefore, it can't be considered harmful. And if then people are attached to it, why not? Why create an obstacle to them where it's not necessary? Whereas I would say Pope Francis's explanation in his letter with Traditionis Custodes is something along the lines of the faith before Vatican II and after Vatican II is essentially the same, and we have changed the liturgy. Therefore, the liturgy of today can express the perennial faith of the Church. Therefore, there's no need for an earlier form of it. That's my speculation.
Thank you, Father, for your talk. In many regions, even during the time of Jesus, the language that was used in the synagogue and the temples was an ancient language. During the time of Jesus, on the streets, people spoke Hebrew, but when you went to the temple, they used, in the streets they spoke Aramaic, but in the temple they used Hebrew, and even, for instance, the Muslims, they used the ancient language. And even today, the charismatics who pray in languages, in every culture, in every region, there is a recourse to that language that is so traditional. So that goes to your point that Latin is so important, because being an ancient language, it doesn't change much. The problem with our modern languages, they keep on evolving every day. For instance, I'm a fan of Bishop Fulton Sheen, but sometimes I'm scandalized by reading him. English not my first language. He uses the word gay to mean something good, but for me, whenever I read it, wait. Because for me, in the modern English, the word gay means something else. My student told me I had a baseball hat. He told, Father, you have a sick hat. Sick. I didn't know what it means. And I wanted to say, this student is very disrespectful. But later on, he told me it means really cool hat. So the problem with our modern languages, they keep on evolving, and even within the liturgy itself, we end up speaking things that we do not know. So also, Pope Leo XIII said, if the church is one, there must be that one language that unites it. That's a very good point. You can imagine being at home and you have each person speaking their own language. It takes away that Catholic. I think as you may say, I come from Africa. We have, in my country, we have over 35 tribes. But I think this politicization of the language is a Western thing, which I think, forgive me, so nonsensical. We have different languages, but at least that one thing that unites us, like the official language of the country, is English. No one feels as if it's a language for the colonial masters or whatever, but people feel unite together because you can understand each other. And I think, as you said, we need to go back to that real understanding of who we are. And I think this politicizing of the language, it's so nonsensical. Thank you so much for your talk, Father.
Oh, thank you, Father. Yeah.
Would you care to comment, Father, on the concept that there's a spiritual dimension to the use of Latin in the church? That it has, if I can use the word, an anointing that might be missing in our everyday English, for example.
Yeah, thank you. I have said that my opinion is Latin is not a sacred language per se, but I do think it is a sacred language. I think it's a sacred language because of what it has acquired. You know, not because as a language in terms of grammar and lexicon, it is somehow descended from the heavens, but because of what it has acquired, because of how God has used it in his plan. One particular example would be in the development of the Roman Rite. The Roman Rite developed with the Latin language as it took shape with its own identity, and with Gregorian chant at the same time. And those two are intimately united together, so that there is a hieratic use of Latin in the liturgy, especially, that it expresses our identity as Roman Catholics in a way that no other language really can, because the Roman Rite simply has grown up with it. Also, the mere fact that it has been used and that the sacred music has developed around it for so long, that creates a continuity. And as Father was saying, in religions that are ancient and that aren't just from 10 minutes ago, you always have the preservation of archaic language. This happens in English, for example, like the Our Father, right? They suggested modernizing the Our Father about 20 years ago when they were first drafting the Roman Missal, a new translation of it. They wanted the draft has an up-to-date version of the Our Father in it, and thankfully that didn't get through, because the version we say is almost 500 years old, because that just happens naturally with things that are very sacred and important to people. And so Latin has that, only centuries and centuries more of it. So I think that anointing has come through time, through the fact it's been used by the saints and sacred things for so long.
Thank you, Father Schrader. My question is, what do you believe are the main causes of the decline of Latin in the past 60 years, despite the many endorsements from the popes that you showed us?
Yeah, it's not the only example of something the church has asked for on the official level that has somehow not been implemented. I'll just say there were a lot of other things happening, and it was a tumultuous time. I'm not a sociologist, but the late 1960s involved a lot of cultural upheaval, student protests, Vietnam War, crisis of authority. All sorts of things. There seemed to be a great desire to throw off the shackles of the past and to move forward in a new direction. I will say probably one of the motivating factors seems to have been a real evangelical spirit. So at the Second Vatican Council, when the fathers discussed at length what to do about language in the liturgy, and I've read this, and there's a lot. They talked about it a lot. And there was not just two camps on it. There was a whole spectrum of opinions. Some people said everything has to stay in Latin. Some said the exact opposite of that. Most were somewhere in the middle. But the reason why anyone wanted to move away from Latin was always to reach the people, so that the people would be able to pray the Mass, that the people would get the message of the gospel, the people would be able to participate. So there was a great motive. And Pius XII even recognized that too. And even the Council of Trent recognized that, actually. When the Council of Trent raised the question, should we translate the Mass into other languages, it was, well, for the sake of the people. And what Trent said was, we'll leave the Mass in Latin, but we'll have the priest give a sermon to explain to people what's happening. So it was a different approach, but the motive was very good. So I think it was a cultural upheaval and a great desire that we've got a missionary spirit.
Maybe just two more, if there are any other questions. Yes.
Father, a lot of people who are Latin Rite attendees or FSSP priests even indicate that the baptism done in the Latin Rite is more effective than the English baptisms. And exorcists often refer to Latin prayers as being more powerful in their exorcisms. What would you reply to those?
Yeah, I've heard that from exorcists. I'm not an exorcist in that sense, so I don't have that experience personally. So I kind of have to take their word for it. As to why that would be, I could speculate. I would say it could just be the fact that, you know, these particular prayers in this particular form have been used for so long, and when the devil or the demons hear them, maybe they think of all the other times they've heard those prayers and all the saints who said those prayers and that kind of thing. So as far as baptism goes, I would be very careful. The essential efficacy of the sacrament would be identical no matter what language it's celebrated in. You could perhaps make an argument that some of the prayers surrounding baptism, which are sacramentals, would be more or less effective for a given audience depending on circumstances or things like that. But the sacrament itself is one, and its effect is one, so you have to be very careful about that. I would also again just point out that prior to Vatican II, you could celebrate almost all those other prayers before baptism in English. A couple of exceptions.
All right, well, Father, thank you so much. And before you go, before we all depart, I just want to make sure everybody grabs a flyer on their way out for the fourth and final installment of the Catholic Culture series. It will be our very own Mr. Mark Haas. That's on Thursday, March 27th, right here at 7 p.m. So let's thank Father Schrader one more time.